I was taken from an African village when I was just a child. I was given a foreign name. They told me who to serve, how to live, and when to keep quiet. But one day I ran away. I ran with a child in my arms, and I raised him to be what I wasn't allowed to be. Free. Subscribe, and write in the comments, what does freedom mean to you? The village woke with the sun, as it always did. First came the birds, loud, excitable, darting between branches like gossiping children. Then came the voices of the women, laughing softly at one another as they knelt beside the river, scrubbing cloth in circular rhythm. And finally, the smoke rose. From cook fires, from incense bowls, from the burning of sweet herbs meant to chase bad dreams away. The world came to life with heat and scent and the murmuring of stories that had been told so long they lived in the dirt itself. Nadella rose with the others, her long limbs still clumsy with sleep, her hair uncombed but wild, in a way her mother always said reminded her of ocean foam. She was 12 now, old enough to gather yams without being watched, old enough to fetch water without spilling it, old enough to be called back from playing if a man's eyes lingered too long. But not yet a woman. Not yet. Their home sat near the edge of the village, not far from where the palms met the sea. The salt came in with the wind, curling through the grass and catching in the mouths of children. Nadella had never seen anything more beautiful than her mother squatting over a basket of herbs, humming to herself as she worked, skin like dark wood, strong and smooth, fingers always busy but never in a hurry. Her name was Tima. Everyone called her Healer. Nadella called her everything. Her father, Timo, was a fisherman, quiet and tall, with a voice that barely rose above the waves he rode into. He spent his days speaking to nets and water, and his nights telling stories that only came alive when the fire burned low. Nadella loved his stories. She loved them more than roasted bananas, more than the new copper bangles she had received during last season's rain feast. But the best stories came from her grandfather, Koro. His back was bent and his teeth few, but his voice carried the authority of a man who had spoken to spirits and lived to tell it. In the evenings, the children would sit at his feet, skin sticky with the day's heat, and he would tell them about the time the moon married a crocodile, or when thunder fell in love with a girl made of smoke. His stories made the world feel old and magical, but also safe, as though even mischief had a pattern to it. Nadella was happiest in those moments, the fire crackling, her sister Bena nestled against her side, their parents' low voices behind them, and the village breathing together like a single chest. That was what home was. A rhythm. A song you didn't have to learn because it was already in your blood. But even in the music of home, a dissonance had begun. It was in the way the elders stopped talking when children approached, in the glances exchanged at the river when the subject turned to strangers seen upriver, men with cloth wrapped too tightly around their waists, skin pale or red-burned, weapons on their backs. Some were accompanied by others who looked more familiar but did not speak the language right. There were rumors, always rumors, of neighboring villages burned in the night, of people vanishing, of a man taken in broad daylight while collecting honey, of the coast men who did not trade but took. Still, life continued. Fear, after all, was not new, and the land had always been dangerous. Nadella was warned not to stray too far when she went to gather mangoes. She was told to avoid certain trails in the late hours. She obeyed mostly. The day it happened started like any other. The air was humid, thick with the promise of rain that would not come. Nadella and Bena argued as they made their way to the river. Bena insisted she could carry the pot all the way back without spilling a single drop. and Dela, older and taller, said that was impossible and that she was still a baby. "Am not," Bana huffed, sticking out her tongue. They laughed. It echoed off the trees. The first thing they noticed was the smell. Not the scent of cooking or firewood, but burning, fast and sharp. The kind that didn't rise in lazy spirals but pushed through the air like a blade. Then came the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but a sudden absence. The birds were gone, the insects quiet. Even the trees seemed to freeze. And then the screaming began. Nadella dropped the pot before it shattered. She grabbed Bena's hand and ran, heart in her throat. Smoke crawled towards the sky in thick black tongues. Men shouted, some in the language of the village, others in a harsh, barking tongue that sounded like the cracking of bones. She saw flashes of light, heard the crack of thunder. Only there was no storm. That sound, it came from long sticks the strangers held. Fire exploded from them. Her mother's voice called her name. Once, sharp, then gone. She didn't know how long she ran. The world became a blur of dirt and smoke and bodies falling. Bena's hand slipped from hers. Someone grabbed her hair. She kicked, scratched, screamed. Hands like iron seized her arms. A cloth was shoved in her mouth. Her limbs were bound, her screams muffled. She watched her village burn through a veil of tears. They gathered the captives in what had once been the ceremonial circle. And Della saw bodies, twisted and broken. She saw the baobab tree where she had once danced, wrapped in flame. Her mother's shawl lay in the dust, stained red. Her sister, she did not see her again. She remembered a man shouting in a language that stabbed the ears, another laughing. Then she was pushed with others into a line, forced to walk. Days passed, maybe more. She didn't count them. She was hungry, then numb. The heat never lifted and her feet bled. She remembered the sea. She had seen it before from the safety of the cliffs. But this was different. The water went on forever, dark and roiling, and at its edge sat monstrous ships with teeth of rope and wood and iron. One of them loomed like a creature from Koro's darkest stories. She was loaded onto a boat, ferried out with others to the floating prison. A man shouted again. A hand pushed her head down as she was shoved onto the ship's deck. She looked up, eyes burning, and saw birds circling above. Free. Screaming. They asked her name. She didn't answer. Someone said, "Call her Adelaide, that'll do." A scratch of a quill, ink on paper, a name written. She had been Ndella, child of story and salt and song. Now she was a number. Now she was cargo. But somewhere inside her, where no one could reach, her name still burned like an ember waiting for wind. She would not forget. Even if the sky went silent, even if her tongue dried, even if no one else ever said it again, she would remember. The darkness was not like night. Night was something Ndella had known all her life, a gentle thing, humming with insects and the murmur of wind, sometimes filled with laughter or the low songs of her mother. But this darkness had no breath. It pressed against the skin, thick and silent, as if the ship itself had swallowed light and memory whole. She had lost track of time even before they locked her in the hold. There had been the long march, the searing sun, the salt sores on her lips. Then the sea, with its stench of fish and human waste, and the brief, hot air above the deck. Now, only rot and sweat and groaning wood surrounded her. They were packed together, bodies chained at the wrist and ankle, side by side like salted meat. Ndela was pressed between a boy whose ribs stuck out like branches and a woman whose belly bulged with pregnancy. Neither of them spoke. The boy whimpered softly through the night. The woman breathed heavily. Her hands curled around her stomach as though she could protect the child growing there from the stink of death. The first day, if it was truly a day, Della cried until her throat was raw. No one responded. Her voice died in the heat. She learned quickly not to move too much. Movement brought chafing, cuts, kicks from the guards above. She learned to piss where she lay, like everyone else, to press her lips shut and swallow the bile rising from her gut. She did not speak. She barely thought. She only repeated her name silently, like a prayer carved into her chest. Della. She heard people dying. Their final breaths rattled beside her, sticky and weak. The guards came every morning with buckets and dragged the corpses out, shackles clanking as they were loosened. No ceremony, no words. The dead vanished through a hatch and never returned. She imagined the sea floor littered with bones. Sometimes the guards threw down food, gruel in wooden bowls, moldy bread, water that tasted of copper. Fights broke out. Once, a man was beaten to death for snatching food before it touched the ground. His blood seeped between the floorboards. She avoided the bowls. Hunger was easier than punishment. On the 5th, or maybe 7th, morning, she woke to find the boy beside her cold and still. His breath was gone, his body limp, his head rolled against her shoulder as if in sleep. She did not cry. She just turned her face away. Later that same day, a woman spoke to her. "You are not dead," she said in a hoarse whisper. And Della blinked through the dim light and saw her, dark-skinned, older, with braids twisted close to the scalp and eyes that did not flinch. "My name is Kusi," the woman said. "You should eat, or you will be the next one they carry out." Della didn't respond. Kusi leaned closer. "What did they call you before this?" Still, silence. "I was taken from the Riverlands. My husband was a drummer. My daughters danced like they were born in music. They are gone now, but I remember them. That is how I win." And Della finally spoke, barely louder than breath. "Della." Kusi nodded. "Then say it, child, again." And Della. Again. And Della. And so it became a ritual between them. Every morning, before the guards came, before the stench swelled and the prayers of the desperate began, Kusi would whisper, "Say it," and then Della would say her name. One day, she grew sick. The fever crept in like a fog, and she shivered until her teeth ached, her skin burned, her stomach clenched in dry spasms. Kusi wiped her face with a torn piece of fabric dipped in the dregs of a water bowl. She whispered old words in a tongue Della did not understand, her voice steady as the rocking of the ship. "You will not die here," Kusi said. "You are too young to be forgotten." When Della awoke again, the fever had broken. Her throat was cracked, but her mind was clear. That same day, the guards brought her above deck. The light struck her eyes like knives. She cried out and covered her face, but rough hands forced her forward. They hosed her down with seawater, cold, sudden, cruel. Then came the brushes, bristles stiff enough to peel skin. She bit her lip to keep from screaming. Men stood watching, laughing. "She'll clean up nice," one said in a language she barely understood. Another walked around her, eyes crawling over her body. "This one's young?" The brushes returned, scrubbing, scraping, blood mixed with soap. When they were done, she collapsed onto the wet deck, chest heaving. "Back below," barked one of them. As she descended the stairs, trembling, Kusi reached for her. "Do not let them inside your head," she said. "Your name is your shield." But even that night, Della could not sleep. She felt eyes on her, She felt the sea rock not beneath her, but inside her chest. She wondered if she would ever feel clean again. The days passed, or the nights. There was no difference anymore. Time became hunger. Time became rot. Sometimes there were storms. The ship would groan and lurch, throwing them against each other like sacks of yam. Screams filled the hold, water seeped through the cracks. And yet the ship did not sink. Hope became a cruel joke. One night, the pregnant woman next to her moaned louder than usual. Then she screamed. Then she went silent. In the morning, there was blood. And then there was only one body where there had been two. The guards didn't even take her that day. They left her to rot. And Dela watched. When the corpse was finally removed, something hardened inside her. That evening, as Kusi whispered, "Say it," and Dela said her name louder. "Dela." Then again, louder still. "Dela." Kusi smiled for the first time, a faint, tired smile. "Good. Make the walls remember." Eventually, the ship grew quieter. The groans slowed. The shouts above changed tone. Then, one day, without ceremony, the hatch opened and the guards began unshackling them. "We're there," someone said. Kusi squeezed her hand. "Don't forget who you are. They will try to take it again." They were lined up and pulled into the sunlight, and Dela squinted against the brightness. The air was hotter here, heavier but different, thicker with things she didn't understand. Men waited on the shore. White men. Some smiled, others sneered. The guards spoke quickly. There was pointing, inspecting, nodding. When they came to her, one of them asked, "This one's name?" "Adelaide," said a voice behind her. A scratch of a pen, another name stolen. Another lie made law. Kusi was sold first. She gave Dela one last look, unreadable and still. Then she was gone. When it was her turn, a man held her chin in his hand. His fingers were soft, but his eyes were not. "She'll do," he said. That night, Dela lay in a cart full of straw, bound again, her name called by no one. But she repeated it anyway. Dela, 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 so it would not die. So it would live, even here, even in a land that did not want to know her. The house stood tall and pale against the red earth, with white columns like teeth and green shutters that looked like they hadn't blinked in years. It smelled of oil, tobacco, and lemon soap. This was the house of Samuel James, a planter with wealth in land and arrogance, a man who believed that kindness was letting the things he owned sleep indoors instead of under the stars. And Dela, now known to everyone around her as Adelaide, arrived in a cart at sunset. The light painted long shadows across the porch, and she stepped down onto the gravel with stiff legs, her wrists still marked from the shackles. A woman with gray in her hair and hard lines around her mouth greeted her not with words, but with a nod and a gesture toward the back door. Inside, the house was cool and quiet. Too quiet. Voices were low, footsteps were soft, every corner seemed to listen. She was taken to a small room at the top of the stairs near the attic. The walls sloped inward, and there was one narrow window that looked out over the cotton fields. The bed was straw and wood. No pillow. "This is yours," said the older woman, whose name was Mama Joe. "You keep it clean. You do what you're told. Speak only when spoken to. That's how you survive." And Dela didn't answer. Not because she didn't understand, but because silence had become safer than speech. In the days that followed, she was taught how to serve. She learned where the towels were folded, how to pour tea without spilling, how to keep her eyes down but her ears open. She learned how to read the master's mood by the sound of his footsteps in the hall. She learned that there were rules for how to move, how to breathe, how to smile without showing teeth. Samuel James was not loud. He did not beat his workers in the yard. That was what others called progress. But he watched, always watched, and when he wanted something, he spoke softly. He was in his early 30s, broad-shouldered and always freshly shaven. His voice had a slow drawl, and his hands, though not rough, carried the weight of ownership. He never asked. He instructed. He instructed her to bring his tea at dusk. He instructed her to read Bible passages while he leaned in his chair. He instructed her to sit when he grew lonely and listen while he talked of order and duty and how lucky she was to be spared the fields. And then, one evening, he instructed her to stay. The room was dark but warm. A fire crackled in the hearth. She had been about to leave when his voice came, not sharp but firm. "You'll stay here tonight." She froze. I said, "Stay, girl." She turned, met his eyes just for a moment. And in that moment, something inside her detached. Her body stayed. Her thoughts did not. It was not the first time he asked. It was not the last. The other women in the house knew. Mama Jo said nothing, but once left a jar of healing salve on Ndela's shelf without a word. A younger girl named Ruth looked away when their paths crossed. The men did not speak to her. Some looked at her with pity, others with cold envy. She did not cry. She did not scream. Instead, each night, she repeated her name inside her chest like a shield. Ndela. The seasons shifted, the cotton bloomed and was harvested. The air turned cold, then warm again. And then came the sickness. She felt it first as a wave of dizziness while scrubbing the baseboards, then nausea, then a pain in her back that made her fold over, breath shallow and sharp. Mama Jo watched her for a long time, then finally said, "It's coming." "What is?" "You're carrying." Ndela said nothing. Her hands kept working. The pregnancy was long and brutal. Her body fought her every step. She could not keep food down. Her legs swelled. She worked until she collapsed in the hall, and only then was she allowed to rest. Samuel said nothing of the child, but he watched her more. Not with tenderness, never that, but with possession, as if the belly she carried belonged to him more than to her. She gave birth in the laundry room on a pile of old sheets. It was Mama Jo who helped her. No doctor, no celebration. The boy came into the world silent at first, slick and red and small, but when he opened his eyes he cried so sharply that Ndela felt the breath leave her chest. She held him, trembling. He had her eyes. His skin was lighter, his lips shaped like Samuel's, but the weight of him was hers alone. She named him James, not for the man who forced her to bear him, but because she wanted the name to mean something else. A beginning, not a chain. She nursed him in secret at first, fed him while peeling vegetables, held him against her chest with one hand while ironing with the other. She told him stories in the language of her childhood, of river gods and moon daughters, of spirits who carried names from one world into the next. When he cried, she sang to him, low and soft like her mother once had. The years passed. James learned to walk, then speak. He was clever, quiet but watchful. He listened more than he talked. When Samuel passed through, the boy would grow still, measuring him. Samuel offered him books, but never affection. To the world, James was a half-shadow, a child born of something not spoken of. To Ndela, he was the one thing that was real. The house remained the same. Polished floors, white curtains, guests that smiled but never asked questions. But in the attic, behind the headboard of her bed, Ndela carved 4 letters with the tip of a broken comb, Ndela. Each night before sleep, she traced them with her finger. Her son would know her name one day, he would speak it aloud, and no one would take it from him. When the war ended, the house did not change. The fields still hummed with sweat and heat. The same bells rang at dawn and dusk. The same shuffling of feet came down the corridors, the same pots boiled over the same fire. If freedom had come, it must have passed the house by, unnoticed and uninterested, but the words did come. First whispered, then spoken aloud, "We are free now." The president had signed the paper. The Confederacy had fallen. All people held in bondage were to be released, and Adela heard it first from a boy running past the well. "All of us!" he shouted, breathless. "They said all of us!" The word free echoed through the plantation like a cracked bell, strange and dissonant, full of promise and danger. Some wept, some laughed, some looked over their shoulders, expecting punishment for even hearing it. Samuel James stood on the porch that evening with a glass of amber liquor in his hand and said, "Y'all are free now, free to work for your keep, free to owe me what I've already given you. Don't mistake freedom for charity." He smiled when he said it, and Della did not smile back. She understood quickly that the freedom offered to them was a rope, longer than before but still tied. Samuel had no intention of letting them go. He introduced a new system, debt labor. Wages were promised but never paid in full. Food and housing were charged back against them. Paperwork was filed that no one could read. "You owe," he said when she asked. "Oh, what?" she asked. He looked at her slowly. "Everything." But something had shifted in the air. The lie no longer held. People had begun to look each other in the eye. Young men no longer bowed their heads as deeply. Women whispered behind barrels and under clotheslines. And Della listened. She gathered scraps of stories about others who had left in the night, crossed rivers, followed stars, made it north. Mama Jo, now slower in her step, brought her word of a preacher. "Name's Reverend Milton Fields," she said, handing Adela a torn corner of cloth with letters scrawled in charcoal. "He helps folks, quietly." Adela studied the name as if it might vanish. "Where?" "Few towns over. North of the river. You'll need at least 3 days walking." "And James?" Mama Jo looked her in the eyes. "You take him. That's the whole point, ain't it?" It was. James was 10 now. He had grown tall, with long fingers and a narrow face. He asked questions. He read what scraps he could find. And sometimes he looked at Samuel James with a gaze too steady for a child. "He knows something's wrong," Mama Jo said. "Yes," Della replied, "but he doesn't know how wrong." That night, Della began to prepare. Quietly, deliberately. She gathered what she could: a tin of dried beans, a ragged blanket, a shard of mirror. She tore a strip from her only good dress and used it to sew a pouch into James's shirt. She braided his hair tightly and pressed a small piece of charcoal into his palm. "For writing," she said, "for remembering." She didn't tell him yet, not until the last moment. The chance came with the rain. It fell hard that week, thick sheets that turned roads to rivers and muffled footsteps into silence. The guards, fewer now than before, stayed dry under eaves. Samuel was away at a meeting, and the air in the house felt loose. That night she woke James after midnight. "Put this on," she said. He blinked at her in the dark. "Where are we going?" "Home." He stared at her, then nodded. They stepped out the back door with only the sound of dripping water for company. The night swallowed them quickly, and Della held James's hand tightly. She did not look back. They crossed the edge of the plantation, slipped past the tobacco fields, and entered the woods. She moved swiftly, the paths still fresh in her memory. When James stumbled, she pulled him up. When he cried, she hushed him with soft words in her mother's tongue. By dawn, they were 10 miles away. On the second day, they hid inside a hollowed tree when a rider passed. On the third, they met an old woman who gave them bread and a place to rest under her porch. On the fourth, they reached the river. It was wide, dark, and fast, but there, waiting with a lantern and a flat-bottom boat, stood Reverend Milton Fields. He did not ask questions. He only nodded once. "You're late," he said kindly. "We had to wait for the rain," and Dela answered. He helped them into the boat and rowed quietly. James watched the trees pass on the banks, and Dela looked up at the stars and tried to remember which ones had watched her sail across the ocean so long ago. When they reached the far bank, the preacher led them to a shack hidden behind a line of trees. Inside was warmth and dry clothes and something she hadn't felt in years, safety. "You'll rest here a few days," he said. "Then we'll move you north. I know a family near Cincinnati, good people." "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he replied. "Thank the ones who carried you this far." And Dela sat by the fire that night with James curled against her. She stared at the flames until they blurred. She thought of her mother, of Benna, of Kusi, of Mama Joe, of herself. James stirred. "Mama," he said sleepily, "is this freedom?" She did not answer right away. Then, "Not yet, but it's the road that leads there." He nodded and slept, and for the first time in a lifetime, Dela closed her eyes without fear. She had escaped the house of a man who thought he owned her. Now she would teach her son to own himself. The house where they found shelter was no more than a single room above a butcher's shop in a narrow, wind-bitten alley in the town of Ironside, just south of Cincinnati. The stairs creaked, the window was cracked. The floor had a patch where rain slipped through on stormy nights, but it was theirs. And Dela swept the dust from the corners the first night, and James made a bed from folded blankets. The room was empty except for a basin, a stove that sometimes smoked, and a nail in the wall where they hung their only lamp. But in its silence, Dela could hear something she had not heard in decades. Possibility. She found work by the week's end, scrubbing clothes in the back of a Quaker widow's house. The woman, Mrs. Whitlow, never asked where Dela had come from, nor why she worked barefoot, nor why her son never spoke unless asked. She simply paid her 10 cents for each day of washing, provided water, soap, and silence. In return, Dela gave her all the strength she had. Her hands split open in winter. The soap stung. The steam burned her lungs. But she never missed a day. James, now 11, sat on the porch of the little meeting house down the road, listening to lessons he was too proud to beg for and too hungry to ignore. The teacher, a white woman with strong shoulders and kind eyes, noticed him after a week. "You may come inside," she said, "if you behave." He nodded once. Miss Lillian became a fixture in his life. She gave him chalk, paper scraps, a used book with half the pages missing. She taught him to hold a pencil like a weapon and to wield silence like a shield. When he brought his lessons home, he shared them at the edge of his mother's wash basin. Dela listened without interrupting. She learned through him, sounded out letters at night by firelight, let her tongue learn to say truth and honor and freedom in the language of those who had once stolen hers. By spring, James could read aloud from Scripture. By summer, from speeches. He carried every word like a secret he was preparing to share with the world. Sometimes he asked questions. "Mama, why don't you speak to the neighbors?" "They talk enough without knowing me," she said. "Why don't you tell them your name?" She looked at him and gently cupped his face. You'll say it when I can't." He nodded, not fully understanding but trusting her. They lived simply, one pair of shoes between them, meals of beans and bread and whatever could be spared. When work was slow, Della walked the alleys offering to mend clothes or clean floors. Sometimes she cleaned the butcher's shop below, sweeping away the sawdust and blood. And always she came home with something small for James, a pencil, a button, a folded note from Miss Lillian. On James's 13th birthday, she gave him the last possession she had kept since her time in the South, a strip of faded cloth from Mama Joe's apron, embroidered with a crooked tree and the outline of a hand. "This was given to me by someone who helped me when I couldn't help myself," she said. "Now it belongs to you." He kept it folded in his coat pocket. By the time he was 15, James was speaking at Sunday gatherings. Quietly at first, then with more confidence. He quoted Douglas. He read the Constitution aloud. He asked questions that made older men shift in their seats. "Are we truly free?" he asked once, "if we live in fear of the law?" Afterward, Della pulled him aside. "You must be careful." "I am," he said. "No," she replied. "You're brave. That is different." He smiled, kissed her cheek, and went on speaking. Miss Lillian brought news of an academy in Philadelphia, a place for gifted colored boys, a place where James might learn more than words. "He'll need letters of support," she said, "and travel money, and courage." And Della worked longer hours, took in more laundry, ate less, slept less. She sold the comb she had kept since Africa. She stitched her hands until they bled. She said nothing. When the letter of acceptance came, James was 17. They stood on the train platform that fall morning, wrapped in their best coats, his too short at the wrists, hers patched at the elbows. She handed him a parcel of food and a worn book. He took her hand and held it tightly. "What will they call you there?" she asked. "James," he said, "but I'll remember what you called me." "And what was that?" "My son," she nodded. "And your name?" he asked, softer now. She leaned in close, her lips near his ear. "Della." He repeated it. "Della." Again. "Della." The train's whistle blew. He boarded, found a seat by the window. As the train pulled away, he waved. She did not cry. She stood still, back straight, hands clasped. That night she carved her name again into the wood beside her bed, the second time in her life. She did not light the lamp. She let the dark settle gently over her. She was no longer alone, because somewhere, far down the tracks, someone carried her name in his chest like a banner. He returned taller. James stepped off the train like someone who had never been owned, whose steps answered to no master. His shoulders no longer hunched, his coat no longer pinched at the wrists. His gaze swept the platform not in fear, but in calculation, measuring, seeking, already questioning. And Della recognized the boy she had raised beneath the man he had become, but she also saw something new, something sharp in the set of his mouth, something bold in the fire behind his quietness. He carried books in one arm and newsprint in the other. His voice had deepened, his handwriting grown elegant. He smelled of ink, coal smoke, and something unplaceable, possibility. He hugged her tightly, longer than he had as a child. "I'm home," he said. She only nodded. She could not speak past the knot in her throat. James did not come back to rest. He came back to speak. He took a post at the colored school in town, teaching arithmetic and reading. Children crowded to his room, drawn by the way he made even dry numbers feel like keys to a locked world. But his work extended beyond chalk and slates. At night, he met with young men in quiet rooms above the tailor's shop, in churches after the doors had been bolted, in fields lit only by moonlight. They spoke of dignity, of law, of action. They read the words of men who had written themselves into history and asked what stories would be told of them. Nadella listened from the hallway some nights as James rehearsed speeches in the kitchen. She recognized her own cadence in his rhythm, the strength she had buried in silence now echoing in his voice. The first time he spoke in public, it was on the steps of the courthouse. The sky was heavy with summer heat. White men leaned against their wagons. Colored families clustered under trees. Some clapped. Some stared. A few turned their faces away. James stood tall in his dark coat, the edge of his cuff mended with his mother's hand. He spoke of law, but also of justice, of what it meant to live free in name but chained in practice, of schools that were unequal, of violence hidden behind uniforms, of the slow theft of black breath in a land that swore liberty. "You call this freedom," he said, "but it walks like fear. It eats like silence. It sleeps in our homes and takes our names." The crowd stirred. Some applauded. Some scowled. Later that night, Nadella scolded him gently as she pressed a hot cloth to his sore throat. "You speak well," she said, "but you speak like a man not afraid of being hurt." "I am afraid," he replied, "but I speak because you couldn't." She did not argue. She simply turned away and folded his shirt with trembling hands. The threats came soon after, a note pinned to the door, a muttered warning at the general store. Then, one night, James did not come home. Nadella waited by the window until the stars had turned. Then came the knock. 2 men carried him inside, his coat torn, his face swollen, one eye closed. His ribs were bruised, his lip split. Someone had thrown him to the ground and kicked him until he bled. She said nothing as she cleaned his wounds. She boiled water, tore strips of cloth from her best apron, wiped the blood from his collar. He winced but did not stop her. When she finished, she sat beside him and placed her hand over his. "You are not wrong to speak," she whispered, "but I would rather have you alive." "I won't stop," he said. "You raised me to know better." She said nothing, but later, in the dark, she wept. The next day, he returned to the school. The bruises had not faded, but neither had his voice. He taught that morning with the same fire. And then he met Ruth. She came to a meeting with a stack of pamphlets and a mouthful of argument. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it dared the world to touch her. Her voice was even, but it cut. She corrected James on a date, disagreed with his interpretation of a court ruling, and asked him why he quoted so many men when black women had bled too. He fell in love before she had finished speaking. Nadella met her weeks later. Ruth was not gentle. She did not lower her eyes or wait for permission to speak, but she helped clear the table and washed her own plate. And when Nadella offered her the last of the cornbread, she said, "No, ma'am, that's for you." They were married under the old elm tree at the edge of the schoolyard. The ceremony was simple. Nadella sewed Ruth's veil herself with the hands that ached but did not falter. She sat in the front row with her back straight and her eyes full. A year later, Elijah was born. The boy was quiet, serious from birth, with fists that curled tightly even in sleep. Nadella held him for the first time and whispered, "You come from fire." James and Ruth raised him on books and questions. They argued in front of him so he would learn to disagree. They prayed with him and read to him and let him walk barefoot in the summer so he would remember the earth. Nadella watched from the doorway. She saw her son teaching Elijah the alphabet. She heard Ruth explaining the difference between a protest and a riot. She saw the boy look at her sometimes, curious, cautious. She knew what he was wondering. Why is Grandma so quiet? She wasn't. She had simply said her words long ago, in the dark, in blood, in the silence of a house where her voice had once been stolen. Now she let the others speak. Now she listened. And each time Elijah fell asleep against her chest, she traced invisible letters across his back. Andela. Someday she would tell him, and he would remember. The wind was soft that morning, brushing gently across the porch like the hand of someone long gone. The wood beneath Andela's chair creaked faintly with each slow rock, the rhythm of it in time with the breath that now came to her only in shallows. The porch was her world now. From here, she saw the trees sway and the road curve out of sight. She saw her grandson's books on the steps, one left open with a twig as a bookmark. She saw the sun hit the edge of the windows, warming the floor in wide golden strips. Elijah sat beside her with his notebook balanced on his knees, pencil tapping lightly against his lips. He had grown tall, taller than his father even, and with a steadiness in his eyes that seemed too old for his years. He had asked her the question 3 days ago, gently, almost apologetically. "Grandma," he had said, "who were you before?" At first, she had smiled and said nothing, but the question lingered. It hovered in the corners of the room, in the pauses between her breaths, in the way Elijah looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. So now, she began to answer. She didn't speak in order. The memories didn't come like a story. They came like smells, like colors, like the sudden ache in her hands when it rained. She told him about the tree by the river that bled red flowers in the spring, about her sister Baina, who danced without music, about the time her father caught a fish bigger than his arm span, and how her mother's laughter shook the leaves from the trees. She told him about the fire, the night the sky turned black with smoke, about the ship and the men and the chains, about the darkness that did not end when the sun rose. She told him about the house where no one called her by her name, about the child she bore, about the man who never asked, only took, about the promises she made in silence. She told him about the night she ran, about the river, about the preacher with the lantern, about the snow on the windowsill the first morning they woke free. And she told him, finally, about James, about the boy she raised on stories and salt and defiance, about the man who came back with a voice too large for one town, about the speeches and the bruises and the woman who never looked down, about the child they gave the world. "You," she said, her voice low, soft as linen, "you are what we ran for." Elijah had not moved for nearly an hour. His notebook was half filled with words he didn't yet understand, but wrote anyway, because one day he would. "Can I ask you something else?" he said. She nodded. "What was your name?" She took a breath. It was hard, not from pain, but from the weight of it. The name was not just syllables. It was smoke. It was a river. It was the sun on her skin before she ever saw a whip. "Nadella," she said. "My name is Andela." He wrote it down, carefully, slowly. "Will you remember it?" she asked. He looked at her, eyes shining. "I'll never forget it." She smiled, and in that smile was everything. Later that night, Elijah would read the name aloud to his father. James would nod, his face unreadable for a long moment before he whispered, "She told you." And Elijah would say, "Yes, finally." In the days that followed, he would begin writing her story. Not the one she lived in silence, but the one she whispered only at the end. He would write the name on every page. He would carry it with him into rooms where no one expected it. He would speak it when others had forgotten. And one day, when someone asked him where he came from, he would say, "I come from Ndela." She died 1 week after she told him. There was no pain in her face, no fear. Her hands were folded, her breath slow, her eyes open until the very last moment. She had spent a lifetime in silence, but in the end, her name was spoken, and that made all the difference. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe for more voices that deserve to be heard. Watch the next video to continue the journey. And if you believe someone else should hear this, share it. Stories live when we pass them on.